This session today is the second session of a 4-part series for high leverage practices. And this session happens to cover high leverage practices on assessment numbers 4 through 6. And be sure to register for the remaining sessions, and those registration links for those sessions will also be posted in the chat box. So you have a lot to look for in the chat box today. It is now my pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Tessie Rose Bailey. Dr. Bailey is a national expert on special education, transition, and MTSS RTI for states and districts through the National Center on Intensive Intervention, and the National Center for Systemic Improvement. She is the principal consultant for the National Center on Intensive Intervention and director of the Center on Multi-Tiered System of Supports, or the MTSS Center. She is also the director of the Progress Center, which provides information, resources, tools, and technical assistance services to support local educators and leaders in developing and implementing high-quality educational programs that ensure students with disabilities have access to free, appropriate public education. Additionally, Dr. Bailey serves as the Project Quality Assurance Director for the Wyoming Multi-Tiered Systems of Support Center. The Wyoming Department of Education and our local educators have benefited greatly to have had her support for the last 8 years. And I can speak for myself personally. I am so grateful to have Dr. Bailey as an expert and able, available for us to call on for these kinds of trainings. So it is now my honor to turn the time over to Dr. Bailey.
Thanks, Dina. So I have to say I love working in Wyoming, and even though I'm not physically there at the moment, I sort of feel like I'm there. I've been working in the state for about 7 years right now, and just the amount of growth and innovation that's come out of the state is really exciting. And I'm glad you all are here. I know it's a virtual session, but that's a super neat innovation to increase our ability to access content and collaborate with each other. Something that Dina mentioned that I just want to reinforce is we are looking for your input today. We'll have 2 really short breakouts. And during those breakouts, we hope that you'll use your camera. All you need to do is introduce yourself and share a little bit about yourself. So you're not going to be put on the spot. In the intro, you kind of heard about the Progress Center. And the reason that I'm using the templates for the Progress Center is because its sole purpose is to ensure that students with disabilities have access to and benefit from high quality educational programming. And we know that the use of high leverage practices is a critical piece of the delivery of high quality educational programming. I'd mentioned in the previous session, if you didn't have a chance to do that, check it out. It sort of gives you the sort of background around HLPs and what we know from research of what likely produces the greatest results, where it came from. But one of the things I mentioned in that session is that there really is no single teacher who has the time, knowledge, skills to meet all the needs in their class. And I think sometimes this is hard because in special education, as a special ed teacher, we often feel like we have the sole responsibility to be able to support those students. When we think about, special ed being able to meet the needs of even students with disabilities, we know that's not also possible as well. There's not really a single system that can support every student, right? Like all of these systems work within our school collectively to really make a difference for an individual child, whether they have a disability or not. And so from the Progress Center, what we really promote is the development or the existence of a sustainable ecosystem that really has the capacity of its educators to both develop and implement high quality educational programming. And that includes general ed, special ed, related services, family, community, leader. All of us are part of this collective effort to really support students in their success in our schools. So today's session is really sort of taking a deeper dive from our last session. So I'm going to focus on the high leverage practices that are in what we refer to as the assessment area of practice. And I mentioned in the previous session that, when the original high leverage practices were sort of identified for all educators out of Michigan, they weren't really divided in any sort of category, nor were they sort of listed in any order of priority. But in an effort to really help us understand how do we train teachers, how do we ensure that they have the skill sets necessary for success, there was this movement to break it down and to say these practices fall under instruction and these practices fall under assessment, social, emotional, and behavior, as well as collaboration. And so we're just going to take a deep dive into that assessment piece. I'm also going to model some of these high leverage practices and what they actually look like in practice. There's some uniqueness about the assessment ones. They're not really what you might perceive they're going to be. And that's because we take a step back from what the research tells us is necessary for success and really depend on what policy, particularly the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, outlines for us in terms of assessment. I'm going to share a number of resources throughout today's training. In your handouts, you'll see some attachments that have them, but I'm also going to share the links. I think the bigger thing I want you to take away is there are websites that hold a lot of these things. So if you know where those main websites are, like the highleveragepractices.org or promotingprogress.org, you don't really have to search around through the website. You just know those are your go-to resources for learning more about high leverage practices for students with disabilities. Now, I mentioned we're going to have just 2 breakouts, and this one's only going to be 3 minutes. But when you get into your breakout, just quickly introduce yourself and share a little bit about your experience or exposure to the HLPs, and maybe a question that you have, like, why are we, where did these come from? Why did they just happen? So to kind of put it out there to let others know what you're looking for. And then when you come back, feel free to put those in the chat box so I'm aware of those as well. So we're going to get those breakouts started. Remember, we just have a couple of minutes. So if you're in a group, just make sure you're quick with your introduction, tell a little bit about your HLP experience, and then a question you might have.
All right, I'll send everybody 3 minutes.
Yes, sir. Thank you. Welcome back, everyone. And feel free, if you have a question you want to just say it out loud, feel free to unmute and share. If you want to share it in the chat box. I'm just curious about, what are some of the things that are on your mind about HLPs? And feel free to raise your hand too if you want to get called on. I can't see you, but I think one of my esteemed colleagues can do that. I don't see any questions or comments, but as we move through today's session, feel free to put any comments, questions, ahas, or OMGs in the chat box. You'll also see that there's some emojis or some other things that you can add in there to sort of share your thinking or your thoughts. At the top too, you can see your little, the clapping, raise your hand if you'd like to say something. So for those of you who maybe did not attend the previous session, or maybe you did, but it was really busy, there's a lot of stuff going on, I just want to really briefly review what are the high leverage practices in special education. And I shared in the last session that, we often talk about high leverage practices as if there is a consistent single suite of practices, and there really are 2. There's one that comes out of the University of Michigan, which is Teaching Works. It was designed to really be that those high leverage practices that distinguish us from an educator from a non-educator. And they're quite general. They're used across all domains, categories of, types of schools, grade span, whatnot. And the idea is that every teacher, regardless if they are a special ed teacher, would be using these practices. But what we also know is that there is a need for more specialized instruction for us to be able to provide specially designed instruction, to adapt when the student is not responding to the intervention. And so that's where we start to get to these more specific high leverage practices in special education. Originally, when they were developed, there was this assumption that they were one or the other, right? Like only special educators did one and general educators did the other. And I think we've evolved in our thinking to realize that, you know, in general, there are things that sort of help us understand what is teaching, right? There's a science to teaching, and there's kind of this art to teaching as well. And so in general, high leverage practices are those things that are, you know, the fundamentals of teaching, the way we do business on a day-to-day basis. We also know that they are used constantly and are really critical for helping students learn important content. And that doesn't matter if you're a high school student or a student with a disability or you're in a private school. These practices remain consistently important. They're also important to sort of this development of the social, emotional, and behavioral skills for students. Originally, there was an assumption that maybe they were just for academic instruction, but we think about high leverage practices as essential for a quality school experience for all students. And so because of that, we can use them across grade spans, subject areas, and different types of contexts. And so when we think about this high leverage, it is a term that really emerged in the last decade or so. It wasn't really part of the lexicon in education, but we start to think about it as that it matters really both to the experience of the student or the success of the student, but also the way that we think about teaching as a profession. That if we can't define the practices that are essential to our profession, it makes it really hard to sort of train people to be successful as they become teachers. And so that's where those high leverage practices sort of emerged from. The publication of this, you'll see, didn't come out until 2017. And it hasn't really changed that much. There's general agreement across the field that these are critical practices to supporting students with disabilities, whether they're served in a general education setting or in a self-contained or even a hospital setting. And so they are, you know, similar to the general HLPs, but in a sense, are intensified versions, right? That there's evidence or policy that says these practices or high leverage for this particular population. Just like you might see some high leverage practices for, let's say, English learners, or there are probably some high leverage practices that maybe are more pronounced in kindergarten versus a college setting. Now, last time I shared a couple of little quizzes, and I'm going to do the same thing. But when we think about HLPs, you know, that they were really developed in a different way than the original HLPs for the general sort of teaching profession. And we think about them for special education. We have a lot of things that come into play. We have a federal law that sort of dictates the dimensions of the work that we provide or the services that we provide. And so they have to be unique to this particular population. So in the chat box, I want to give you an opportunity to sort of test your skills. It's not really a Wordle. I know probably a lot of you are playing that, but it's kind of like, you know, like a cool game. But you can just put a 1, 2, 3, or 4 in the chat box and let me know how many HLPs really are unique to special education. In the general practices, you may remember there are 19. But when we think about special education, how many practices do we see? So have a response for it. 19 or 22, 16. Any other guesses? Lots of ones for the 16. All right, so those of you, and I'm going to say this was probably Catherine and Tamara, you are the winners today because it is that 22. There are 22 practices. There are actually more practices that are essential for students with disabilities. Now, the other thing about the practices is, you know, we think about this long list of 22 things that we need to do. And as we talked about last time, they're not really isolated practices. The reason that they are listed as isolated, specifically defined practices is we have to be able to teach those, right? And evaluate the extent to which the educator is using them. But on the flip side, if I'm actually using them, it's not like I do one HLP at this point, and then I do another one, and I do another one. It's often a sort of collection of these practices that allow me to do my job on a day-to-day basis, right? Like when I'm doing instruction, I have embedded assessment, and I may be simultaneously providing support for social emotional skills for a student. And so to help, oh yes, go ahead.
Sorry, there was a question right before you did this, the question to everyone.
Oh, good.
And the question says, all of my experiences in grades 9 through 12. I know many other individuals here are more experienced in pre-K and elementary. Just wondering how the different ways in implementing HLPs in high school versus elementary might look.
Yep. Yeah. And I think it's kind of like MTSS, if you're familiar with that. We've identified critical components, right? Screening, progress monitoring, data decision-making, and instruction, or tiered instruction. There's agreement that those components are consistent K-12, but you probably are quite aware that what it looks like when I actually implement it in a secondary setting is very different than maybe what I do in a pre-K or a kindergarten. And so the same thing occurs with the HLPs, is that, and we're going to talk about one is like that we have multiple data sources that help us understand the strengths and needs of a student. So that would be an assessment HLP. Now, I'm going to have to do that whether I'm a 12th grade teacher working with students with disabilities or a pre-K teacher. Now, what's going to be different likely is the types of data sources that I use, the involvement of the student in some of those data sources. So the actual practice itself is consistent when we say like pre-K to, transition, but the way it actually materializes is unique to the setting. Right? I mean, like how I might use that in literacy is going to look a little bit different, but I'm still using that practice of multiple data sources to understand strengths and needs, regardless of where I'm at. So hopefully that makes sense. And Chris, I'll try to provide some explicit examples as we get to each of these of the high leverage practices in the assessment category. So with that said, I do want to focus on assessment today. We wanted to do a deeper dive to help us understand what it means, because conceptually we're like, oh yeah, it makes sense that we have these core set of practices that say I'm a teacher versus, some other different type of profession. But then I have to think about what does it look like if I'm a 9th grade teacher who teaches social studies or history in a rural setting that's providing online instruction, right? So the practice still exists, but it's going to look different than somebody who's doing it face-to-face in a pre-K setting. So I did share just one of those assessment HLPs, and I just curiosity, how many of you would say there are 3, 4, 5, 6 assessment practices? So just thinking about, what you know about assessment and how critical it is, how many of these HLPs do you see falling in this assessment practice area? Remember, there are 22 total. So how many would be in that assessment area? And you can just put your link in the chat box. So I've got a couple people saying 6s, some 4s. Yeah, so 4, 5, and 6. So we got a lot of mixed results. Well, interestingly, there are only 3. And that's why we're doing it first. It seems like assessment sometimes consumes our day-to-day work with students with disabilities, right? We've got evaluations, we've got transition assessments, writing our present levels of academic achievement and functional performance, benchmarks, state assessment. Like there's a lot of assessment that seems to be happening around special education. But really we're going to focus on 3 that are considered to be high leverage. So I'm going to do it just a real quick true false, and you can just write true in the chat box, or you can write false in the chat box. But if you do look at the list of high leverage practices, you will see identifying short and long-term learning goals is an example of an HLP in the assessment practice area. You see a lot of trues. Okay, well, interestingly, it is false. And that's because when we think about assessment, were some clearly defined dimensions about what does it look like. And while goal setting is often associated with, say, like progress monitoring or writing your IEP goals, the purpose of goal setting is really around guiding our instruction. So we're going to talk about goal setting actually in our next session. We won't talk about it this time, but we often talk about it not just in terms of IEP goals, which are annual goals, but really around being clear about the learning goals that drive the way that we design and implement our instruction. All right, so another one that's listed is conducting FBAs to develop individual student behavior plans is an example of an HLP in the assessment practice area. So what do you think? Is that true or false? Take your best guess. I got a couple trues. I like that, Miranda. Not so sure. Well, this is, Miranda, there was a lot of question like you saying, well, I don't know. And as it came down to it, they said, well, while it's referencing, assessment and goals and this sort of thing, it really is related to social, emotional, and behavior. And this comes back to what I was saying before, is that if you look at every single one of the high leverage practices that are listed, there really is some combination of assessment, direct instruction, evaluation, collaboration that kind of is inherent to all of them. But remember, when they were designed, they were meant to be discrete practices that as a leader or a educator prep provider, I could observe those practices. And so in this case, observing you conducting, behavioral assessments makes sense. The purpose is really around supporting social emotional behavior. Just like what we were talking about, the goal setting was really around supporting instructional, like the selection of the instruction, the design of the instruction. So it doesn't really matter, like, to be honest, no one's ever going to say, oh, well, gosh, that's an HLP and instruction, it's not assessment. But I wanted to make that clarification because if you do go to the website, and I'll show you where that's at in just a second, what you'll find is that maybe you're looking for this functional behavior assessment HLP and you want to learn more about it. You're not going to find it under the assessment tab. You're going to find it under that social emotional behavior. So you're probably going, well, gosh, if those aren't the HLPs, then what are they? And so they really come down to these three main HLPs. And the first one, I mean, as you read these, you're probably like, oh, I kind of do those things. And, if you are a trained special ed teacher, these were likely part of your educator prep program. They're likely part of your ongoing professional learning. And you'll notice that they are critical to your success as a special ed teacher, but also to the success of the student, right? That's why we say they're high leverage. So we're going to deep dive into each of these to give you a sense about what it looks like. If you have some ideas about how you do it or what it looks like in your setting, please put it in the chat box. But sort of in a nutshell, we're saying you're using multiple data sources to identify strengths and needs. That might seem a little familiar to how you do IEPs, right? But the assumption is if we don't understand student strengths or needs, we can't design or deliver instruction, right? We can't design the right context. We can't collaborate with families. We can't connect with students. So it is considered high leverage, meaning it's critical to our job as a special ed teacher and to the success of students. The second one, that HLP5, is interpret and communicate assessment. And you're probably quite familiar with this as well. I mean, think about all the assessment that we talked about at the beginning: state assessments, benchmark data, evaluation data, looking at your 3-year eval, your present levels of academic achievement and functional performance. We don't just collect those data for the sake of collecting it. We collect it, we interpret it, and then we have to communicate it to somebody else. So that's why it would be considered a high leverage practice. It's required for the success of us as teachers, as well as to the student performance in the school. And then finally, the last one probably isn't as much of a surprise, but that we're using those assessment data, we're analyzing what we're doing from instruction, and we're making necessary adjustments. And if you look, when we come back the next time around the instructional HLPs, you'll kind of see some overlap between some of those instructional HLPs and HLP6. And if you are familiar with the data-based individualization process that the State Department has been supporting through its State Systemic Improvement Plan or through the MTSS Center, you'll notice in that validated approach to supporting students who are struggling, there's assessment components and the instruction components. So the assessment component falls here as a critical piece, with the assumption that it's not existing on its own. Now, the importance of assessment in special ed probably is not very surprising to you. I mean, obviously we are obligated under IDEA, depending on where the student is in the process, to evaluate strengths and needs, to identify those, to develop individualized education programs or IEPs, monitor progress of the student within that IEP and the implementation of it, design and deliver our services. And then, sort of stepping back, that while we often think about that high leverage practice is unique to what I do to the student, as you look back at this last one, you'll start to see it's a group of students, not just individual students, right? It's actually both, that we're engaging in that continuous improvement, that we're thinking about the special education program as a whole, that we're thinking about their experience in general education and how do we improve that as a whole. That's part of that, using the data. And really important, about communicating with families and students and other educators. Now, if you were in the last session, I had shared some of those evidence-based high leverage practices. None of those actually show up in the assessment area. And that's a little tricky. They generally show up in the instructional area. And that's because we can tease these practices out and really evaluate the extent to which they impact some type of student performance, whether it's academic or behavior. So when we think about the evidence base for assessment HLPs, they kind of border, there is some research support, maybe not randomized control trials like we might see with an evidence-based intervention or practice, but a lot of the practices that you see under the assessment division are policy related, meaning they're sort of non-negotiable. You're required to do them. Whether they're beneficial to you depends on how you actually implement those practices in your day-to-day work. And I'll give an example. Is if you think about that first one, is using multiple sources of information to develop a comprehensive understanding of student strengths and needs. One of the key features of a high leverage practice is that it's used frequently and consistently, right, across settings and across time. If you're right now just developing, your PLAF once a year, let's hurry up and do a bunch of assessment, understand student strengths and needs, and write in the report, and then implement it, that's not really a high leverage practice. That's more about a one and done type approach. Really what we're doing is, if we have a well-designed system, we're consistently accessing and using multiple sources of data to understand students' strengths and needs, right? Students' needs change over time, they're not static. And so it's more around this consistent use over time, across grade spans, across domains, as opposed to, I did it to create a PLAF. Now, with that said, the policy that supports this area really is IDEA's attention to the present levels of academic achievement and functional performance. And there's two things in here that I think are really important. Is one is that when we think about present levels, the PLAFs, I'll just call it that, we sometimes think about it as the collection of data and the reporting of data, right? And that's not really the purpose, right? If you think about this HLP, it's the use of those data to have a really good understanding of strengths and needs for the student. And so when we think about the development of the PLAF, we're not just reporting multiple sources, we're actually using those multiple sources to create a story about the kid, and what is their strengths and their needs, and how did those challenges that they're having as a result of their disability affect their participation or benefit from general education, right? That's really what determines what a need is. And so when we think about this, academic achievement, we often think about, from our perspective, is just understanding that single need. But if we have a comprehensive need and we're looking not just at where they're struggling, but where they're doing well, I should be able to describe a student's sort of collective, right? Like, oh my gosh, he's really great in math and he struggles with this and reading and he has these friends and he looks like, he performs this way, he has these learning behaviors. I would be able to talk about the performance across multiple areas, not a single area. We were talking about the secondary setting. That's kind of one of those challenges is if we're compartmentalized, I might only know about that student's performance or needs in a particular area. And as a result, I have this narrow view of what I should do and I provide that. But for us to really be able to support a student with disabilities, we have to look at the broader picture, which also includes this academic as well as the functional skills. And I think sometimes functional skills are associated with things like toileting and, brushing your hair and eating and those things. And of course, those are included. But when we think about functional skills, it's that day-to-day work, right? Like the way they're going to be able to be independent post-school or independent in their school setting. And we know that for students who even have mild, moderate disabilities, as they get into secondary settings, we start to see this, we have a really good understanding of what they can and cannot do in academics, but we don't really understand the extent to which their learning behaviors or their executive functioning is impacting their ability to be successful. And part of this is because we engage in this really dreadful disease called a suicide, where we make assumptions, for example, that this kid has autism, which looks like this, or this kid has a learning disability, looks like this, or they're in this placement. And those sort of things, we're using data sources that are not helping us understand strengths and needs. We're using our assumptions, right? And so we kind of have to step back from that. If we use our assumptions, then we sometimes make these decisions based on what we believe versus the reality. And so this HLP really focuses on the use of multiple sources of data to help us sort of get rid of some of that suicide. And the value of this, why this is such a high leverage practice, and this has been for decades, is that our understanding, our comprehensive understanding of a student's strengths and needs is essential for us to be able to design the rest of the programming, right? And when I say programming, not just the instruction, but the behavioral supports, the way we provide supplementary aids and services, related services, because everything else in our IEP starts with that comprehensive understanding of strengths and needs, right? So, we think about these HLPs as equally important and all occurring simultaneously, but what you'll start to see is that, one sort of helps us implement the other, which helps us then implement the next one, right? There's sort of this cycle like we shared last time. And coming back to some of the concerns is that we have to think about the individual student's needs, not the needs of a disability category, of a classroom, of a a certain grade span, right? Like all high school kids do this, or all preschool kids do this. That comprehensive understanding that HLP4 is about the individual, our expertise in the individual's needs to be successful. So just some recommendations and how this looks when it's implemented, is when we talk about multiple test scores, they can be all sorts of things, right? They can be standardized assessments. Those provide us that objective measure, allows us to avoid that assume-aside. We try to look at, what's the impact of that particular need or strength for the student, right? It's not just that it exists, but how is the existence of that impacting this kid's success or lack of success in the setting? And you'll see that third bullet, that fully explaining how the disability in how those needs and strengths impact their involvement in general ed. That is a requirement under IDEA. And so when we talked about, well, there's not really research that supports this particular HLP, but there is federal policy that says this is critical. There's guidance from OSEP, there's supplemental case law that says, yes, this is a critical high leverage practice across the grade span. And one of the things in implementing this particular practice is it's got to be built into our day-to-day work, right? Built into that ecosystem. Like I said, we can't just wait till like a month before the HLP, collect a bunch of data, and then create the document. That's not the purpose of the HLP. It's the HLP is, that's part of it, the development of the PLAF, but it also helps me engage in the ongoing delivery of that particular IEP that I've developed. So creating these writing routines help us really be more efficient, right? In our practice of using assessment in special education for summarizing and documenting a student's strengths or needs. And so, this is just an example. You might have your own sort of routine or template to help sort of facilitate efficient writing or efficient communication with others. But I think about this, whatever data source indicates the student does this, which affects his or her ability to do this. And as a result, the kid needs this, right? So it gets at that using multiple data sources, right? So there could be, this is one, this is another, and then it demonstrates that collective need. And so an example, of what it might look like is weekly summaries of direct behavior rating indicate, right, that this kid is academically engaged 30% of the time of a 45-minute block, which affects his ability to attend and benefit from general education at the same rate as his peers, right? So that's a federal requirement that we're implementing, right? That we're using these data to get an understanding of the need. We haven't got to the strength yet. His peers, engage at this level, and as a result, he needs. And in this idea of sort of understanding strengths and limitations is we have to then justify what are the prerequisite skills or the underlying skills that we're going to leverage to be able to design and implement the instruction. Now, there's a ton of different data sources that are available. And I would say like at the secondary level, a critical source that's often underutilized is interviews and surveys of students and families. It's a little bit trickier at the younger grades, but it's still a critical part. But if we're looking for active engagement of students in the use of that, it's not just what we do, but how we facilitate that, we're going to have better outcomes. Your traditional screening, benchmark data, inventories, checklists. You think about transition assessments. They can be observations of students completing, employment skills. If you're a preschooler, is the way that they're engaging in some functional skill. So it could be, like we were talking about, the way it looks differently across the grade span. It really is not so much the grade span that we see the difference. It's the uniqueness of that student, right? What does that student need to be able to do, and what data will show us whether the student can do it or not, and what is their needs or strengths in doing that. So I just want to stop right there and in the chat box, you know, thinking about all the data sources. Like I guarantee you guys are doing this sort of HLP in your site. Maybe it's not as intentional or as consistent across the year, but think about your day-to-day work. You have this constant input of data, whether it's observation, your information from your curriculum that you're using, state assessments or benchmark data. What are the types of data that you use in an ongoing way to really have a good understanding of students' strengths and needs? You can just put a couple in the chat box, or you can unmute and share out. So I see observations. Yeah, and the thing about observations is, you know, we have this informal observation, like, gosh, I'm sort of seeing he's not getting it. And then we have these more formalized observations that help confirm or disconfirm our assumptions. So thanks for sharing that, Miranda. How about others? Oh, I know you use some data. Yeah, engagement's critical, Catherine. And we'll talk about that on one of the other days. But when we think about the comprehensive understanding, we sometimes say, oh my gosh, they're really terrible in doing this particular literacy skill. But talking about what you just did is, what's their engagement level? What's their attendance level? What's their social emotional skills to be able to engage? Yeah, formal assessments from specialists or your school psychs. Yeah, observations, definitely. CBMs or CBAs. Thanks, Victor. Yeah, so this is where, I mean, these are not new practices, right? You're doing them, but I think it's that validation that what we're doing is important. And then just making sure, if we're doing that we're being intentional and consistent across the year, right? Not just like right before we do our IEP. Miranda, totally. The parent conversations, it's a critical piece, and we often don't think about it as part of our, let's say, PLAF statement, but it helps us really gain a good understanding of the student's strengths and needs, because maybe they don't have a lot of challenges at home, but they're really struggling at school. Or in some cases, the parent says they're really struggling at home and you don't really see it at school, right? We're trying to support the whole child, and we need to have that comprehensive understanding. Awesome. Well, thank y'all. So just real quick, you know, if we think about that comprehensive statement as part of the IEP, you know, it has like multiple purposes, but from an HLP standpoint, from a high leverage practice, which does it really help us do, right? Is it just documenting so we get our checkbox? Is it just telling us, you know, the components, or is it just listing those things, it describing all of their needs? And what we start to see is that if we think about this comprehensive understanding of strength and needs outside of the IEP as a critical piece of successful teaching and helping students be there, then we understand it. The whole point of it is to help us understand what are the needs that the student has, so that I can select the learning goals or learning targets that we'll talk about, and then make sure the instruction matches those. So in your handouts, and I won't go over it too quickly, but you know that I think we sometimes overlook this part because it's not something we implement. And that's why I say it's really hard for us to look at the research base for a PLAF. But we have found that, you know, when we find effective instruction or we find benefit of special education, we can go back and see that these were critical pieces of that comprehensive understanding. This is also supported by IDEA, these components, but it's helping us understand the baseline of that student's needs, and then connecting this student to the right services to address those needs. So there is a handout that's in there, and I'll actually show you where you can get it. I'll put the link in the chat box. But there are, for each of the HLPs, there are a number of free resources that are available. But this particular HLP, there there's a tip sheet, there's a module that's out, and then there's also a webinar if you just want to sit back and watch it. All right. And so you'll see that there are some tips and tricks, right, for how to do that. It's talking about some of the things we just said is, thinking about it more than just listing all of the assessment data. And I think that sort of assessment is a little confusing, but really using that data is critical. So I want to talk about the next two, and similar to HLP 4, HLP 5 also doesn't have the same research base, but it definitely has the policy base that indicates it's an essential high leverage practice for supporting students with disabilities. And you'll see this interpreting and communicating assessment. It's a skill that we can observe teachers do, and we can see whether there's an impact on performance of students, thus making it high leverage. The stakeholder piece is often where we sometimes don't think broad enough, right? So who are those stakeholders? To be honest, that number one stakeholder is the student. One of the practices, right, is to be able to interpret and communicate feedback to the student, right? If they need that information to be able to turn around and understand what they do or understand what they need to do next. That feedback piece will also show up as a separate HLP. But these other stakeholders, right, leaders, administrators, your specialists, related services, community providers, and families are also our stakeholders. And so the thing about this high leverage practice is that we have to understand the cultural and linguistic needs of the people we're communicating to, and how I communicate to a school psych is very different than how I might be communicating to a family who, is this student's going to be a first generation graduate. And so this high leverage skill or this practice of interpreting is not just can I interpret it, but can I interpret it and differentiate the way that I communicate that information to the right audience. This is really critical when we think about IEP teams. And one of the major procedural violations, for example, is if parents don't feel like they can be fully engaged within the IEP team meeting. And part of that is they'll say, well, gosh, they were sharing data, I just didn't get it. I didn't really understand what all those fancy assessments were. So one of these high leverage practices is, while we think about it from a instructional standpoint, ongoing parent-teacher conferences and that sort of thing, it's also around how do we interpret and communicate that information at an IEP meeting. So in reality, that's sort of this HLP is, helping people understand what's the most important thing they need to gain from this information, right? It's not that I gave it to you, right? Look, here's a pretty graph, but I have to believe and I have to ensure that the people receiving the information have enough knowledge to be able to understand how I'm communicating it. You'll see that the data is used collaboratively. It's a critical piece of this HLP. So we talked about the previous one is using multiple data sources. It's unique to understanding strengths and needs. This one is now using that information with multiple people to come up with a plan to support the student. And that's a completely different skill than the other one, right? So we think about it as discrete high leverage practices. This last one too is understanding the purpose of assessments. When we go into an IEP meeting, we sometimes defer to somebody else. Oh, well, the school psych knows that. It's really upon us to make sure everybody's at that meeting has enough understanding around why that assessment was administered and what do the data mean for decision-making around eligibility or instructional delivery. And just remember, that when we think about this type of assessment, that there really is this difference between monitoring progress and progress monitoring. We often think about monitoring progress as the HLP. And so you'll see that here aligns with this HLP of ongoing, I'm using it on a day-to-day basis. where we think about progress monitoring as an evidence-based practice. And so it's kind of the nuances in language is really important. But what's most important is we're using data for the right purpose, right? That I don't just take my running records and use them for progress monitoring, because that's not their intended purpose, right? Or I don't use a single progress monitoring data point to make a decision around what I'm going to do right now for instruction. We have to understand that there are unique ways in which we use certain types of data. And so just something to consider with this particular HLP in this condition of writing an IEP is, that understanding of the needs and strengths that come from HLP 4, right? We can write a great summary, but if we don't share that with all of the folks that we're working with, we can't collaboratively use that data to design and deliver the instruction. So you'll see that, providing that information from multiple sources from HLP4 allows us to then use that data in a way that we can collaboratively program. And it ensures that families can meaningfully participate in the development of the IEP. So it allows you to meet the procedural requirements and the substantive requirements under IDEA while also supporting students. So I just want to share, a way to do this. And this is actually a practice that's applicable to, lower elementary all the way up through high school. But we think about that stakeholder group. I talked a lot about the IEP team, but communicating with students and families on a regular basis is an essential part of successful special education programming. We want to make sure when we think about this is that how frequently we're going to provide information, the format we're going to provide it, and the approach, right? Are we, is it good enough to just send home like a graph of the student's data? Or do I need to have a phone call and walk somebody through this? Or do I need to train my high school student to be able to interpret their own data and articulate that to their families? We do know that, different folks are going to need different levels of support. A new general ed teacher who doesn't have experience with special education assessments might need more support, where, a school psych may need very little support in interpreting that data. So in your handouts, I shared this 6-step protocol and I'll walk you through it, but I'm going to share the link. You can get the full training. This engagement of students with disabilities in the co-interpretation and the sort of communication of it has its own effect, right? So this is where I say there's not a lot of research on collaborating, but there is some emerging research on certain parts of it. And engaging students with disabilities in this interpretation process helps build their own self-awareness, which is in and of itself a high leverage practice, but also can help you sort of be more thoughtful about next steps. So the way that this particular practice works, so this would be an example of a way in which you might implement this high leverage practice. It's an instructional routine that can be used at different grade spans. This is an example of one that could be used for literacy or math. It's sort of domain agnostic, but it helps me have an instructional routine to collaboratively interpret and use data, right? So in this case, this teacher works with the student, and you'll see everything that's in black is kind of your script, like what you would say. And you say something like, now I'm going to calculate, your score, whatever I'm doing for that particular assessment, whether it's an informal assessment or a formal progress monitoring, it's up to you. And your score is blank, right? Think about how often that students actually hear their score. And then think about how often they actually understand what that score means in the context of progress monitoring or as representing their performance. So you'll see that there's always specific and true positive feedback. I like, or I noticed that you did this. So there's something that's the strength that's building on our understanding of the student's strengths, but also letting them know you recognize that. And then working collaboratively, which is your HLP 5, around the use of data. So let's graph these data. Let's, put it on paper. Let's see what it looks like. And then that co-interpretation, right? So we're engaging different stakeholders, in this case, the student. So let's look at what this graph shows us. Did your score go up, down, or stay the same? So you can see it's pretty low level. You could use this for, students who are lower elementary, for kids who have more significant cognitive disabilities, but you could actually make it more advanced if you're working with kids who are higher functioning, but are also monitoring their own performance. So there is that interpretation. It's not me telling, it's me helping facilitate their response. And then that reflective questioning. And this is where we get it. It's not just telling you what your performance is, but it's collaborating with you to say, based on these data, what do we need to do now? And so in this case, what have you been doing? So, gosh, I've been practicing, it really worked. And then did you accomplish your goals? So that's that self-reflective piece. And then, what do you need to do to move forward? So it's putting some of that learning behaviors on the student by using that data collaboratively with the student. So it's just a sample. This has been is a validated approach for collaborating with students across grade spans. Pretty low level, effort, but it helps us think about this instructional routine. So we have these practices at the ready, no matter what subject or what context we're working in. So I'm just curious, how many of you do something like this, or are very intentional about the routines in which you support students? Maybe you have a routine that you work with families. I'd love to hear, how are you sort of thinking about this particular practice in terms of its implementation? Don't be shy. I know I probably talk too much, and I super apologize for that. I'll open it up to anybody who wants to share. Yeah, Miranda. Well, and I don't think we think about it, right? I think we often think about assessment as, I'm supposed to collect these data. I'm supposed to share these data. And so we do that, right? Like we say, here, your student did this. They're like, is that good or bad? And you say, that's good. And then we sort of move on. But this sort of formal routine can increase overall student performance through this HLP. Thanks, Miranda. Miranda, you get a gold star for being an active participant. So thank you. All right. Well, I want to share the last practice, and this is one of those that does have an evidence base, right? The first two were really supported by policy, particularly IDEA. You're probably doing those on a regular basis, and it's a good time to kind of reflect and say, to what extent, if I really moved into that full use in a collaborative way, that's really where we want to be. And there's always room for, growth in this area. This one, though, is where we see greater effects. So in HLP 6, we want to use student assessment data. So this is actual performance data of the student. We analyze our instructional practices, right? So we look at what happened to the student, and then we look at what we did, and then we look at why is what we're doing not leading to the expectations that I want to see. And then we make adjustments, right? So if you're familiar with database individualization, it's kind of like what we refer to as step 3 of the process. And as I mentioned, this is one of those assessment HLPs that has a pretty robust evidence base. When we think about point 4, we're talking big effects. And in this case, you see on average between 0.68 and 0.90. So if we can utilize this in a systematic way, we're likely to see huge gains. And so you look at this here at the bottom. This is an illustrative example of just 4th grade students. The study itself has it across grade spans, but it looks at the use of this particular practice in combination with intensive instruction, which we'll talk about next week, that when those two high leverage practices are used together, that we produce these very large effects. And in many cases, students have higher levels of progress or growth on average than their non-disabled peers, right? It doesn't mean they're performing higher, right? Because it could mean they started lower, but their growth trajectories are greater than their same age peers, which is really necessary to close that gap. And so the thing about this, so if you look back at this goal, right, we use assessment data to make a decision about response or non-response. We analyze what we're doing, trying to figure out what's leading to that response, and then we make a change. So in this case, we look at the student's response. You know, we like, yeah, we're doing it. The kid is right on track. They're moving towards expected growth. What I would do then is analyze what I do and say, wow, this student benefits from, and then I would be able to articulate it, right? That helps me develop an IEP in future programming for the student. Same here. So you can give me a thumbs up, or you can give me, I don't know if you can give me a thumbs down, maybe you can in the chat. You know, when you look at this particular student, how is this student doing, right? So if you had to use assessment data and analyze it, what are you seeing in terms of this student's growth or performance? So the red line would be the goal that was set, and then the blue boxes are data points that were collected over time. Yeah, so I see a thumbs down. How about others? Yeah, trending downward. Yeah, and so Catherine, what you noticed, it's like, well, some days it was good, right? Like there's possibility, we see it. And this is that sort of practice of using the performance data and saying, wow, that's interesting. What is predicting that? So like what Catherine said is, look, I got these two data points. What I might look at and say, what was better about that day that led to that performance, as opposed to what happened on these 2 days that led to poor performance. Because then as a teacher, I can use that information and say, I'm not going to do that anymore, or I need to do more of this to increase that consistency. So yeah, so Rachel's saying down, yeah, we've got this inconsistent performance, and that makes it hard for us, and we have to understand why. All right. So what about this one? Is this student making progress? You know, if we looked at their performance data, what are some of the things you notice, and what would you want to look at in terms of, you know, your own practice? What questions might you ask yourself? Yeah, so Terry's saying slow, steady progress. Like visually, I can kind of see it go up, but like as Victor said, we're not likely to meet the goal. And I think that's really where, you know, we talk about the learning goal. That's a different HLP. I think it's HLP 10. But we have to understand the extent to which, you know, that we set that learning goal. That's where the instruction is targeted. And what we're finding is our performance data indicates the kid's not doing that. So as part of this HLP, I have to analyze my instructional practice. So what might be some things that I'll look for myself? So what kind of things might I analyze about my own practice? So I'll give an example, like, am I using the HLPs? You know, maybe I don't know the instructional HLPs, which are supposed to promote, you know, strong growth, or maybe I'm using them inconsistently. right? So that's, I'm kind of analyzing it. Yeah, exactly. So maybe that I'm looking at my intervention. Was it designed? Did I pick the right materials? Am I using them in the right way? And this is where we look at fidelity. Yeah, so like Catherine's saying, none of these adaptations seem to be making the amount of growth that we need, right? And so this is where, revisiting the adaptations. And the other thing, Catherine, is maybe revisiting, maybe we're just adapting to the wrong thing, right? Because if we are adapting something, we had a platform that we started out with, and maybe that we just had we started out bad, which kind of is evident in this first part, and we're doing all these adaptations to try to fix it. That's where we might have to say, gosh, this is not going in the direction we want to go. Let's make an adaptation or an adjustment, which could be a different intervention, a different placement, a different level of service based on these particular performance data. Yeah, same thing here, right? We can easily see it. They're like, performance data indicates kids tanking. But what it doesn't tell us is why. Why is this kid doing it? So that's the analysis piece of this HLP, is we need to have a better understanding or develop a hypothesis about why the student's data look like this, so we can make an appropriate adjustment. Now, what's kind of cool about this is there's been a lot of really easy resources to help us do this in a sort of efficient way. And in order for it to really be a high leverage practice, we have to be able to use it, right, consistently over time across different domains and contexts. So if it's overly cumbersome or takes a lot of time, we would often not see that as a high leverage practice. So what we want to know is why, from an instructional analysis standpoint, why is it not working? So we'll close up today's session with this particular resource. So I shared at the beginning, that writing the PLAF, there's a tip sheet to help you implement that HLP4. We have the sample instructional routine for code interpretation and code communicating about progress for students. That was that second one. And this one can help us really engage in looking at student assessment data, analyzing what we're doing, and identifying the necessary adjustments. And so to do that, we need performance data. So that's an essential data source. And we need to really understand or evaluate, is the design okay? Is the delivery okay? Or is there some unique need about this student that I'm not accounting for in my design and delivery, right? So a lot of it all comes back to what we do, and what, the student's performance helps us understand if what we're doing is the right specially designed instruction, the right supports for the student. So this particular resource here, and I'm going to have to, hopefully it works. There we go. And I'll put the link in the chat box because I want to just give you a couple of minutes. That way you don't have to hear me talk. And I'd like to send you into breakouts if that's at all possible. But you got to make sure you chat with people in your breakout. So in this case, like while you're getting set up and whatnot, before we go into the breakouts, the thing about this is that, for one, we have to look at our effect. That's the using student assessment data. That's the first part of that HLP. Analyzing instructional practices, design, and delivery. So you'll see that this particular resource helps us reflect on the design. What about that is working or not working, and our delivery, right? And based on our responses to this, then we can make a hypothesis and make an adjustment to that particular design and delivery. So I want to give you just a little bit of time. Maybe we'll do 5 minutes this time, Jeff.
Gotcha.
And so just to take a look, make sure you click on the link in the chat box. If you're, I think you're going with the same people, I don't really know, but if they're new people, make sure you introduce yourself. And then think about the extent to which this particular resource, can be used to help you analyze your instructional practices and think about the adjustments that need to be made to support student performance. And then we'll come back and formally close up.
I'll just let everybody know some rooms have changed as people have jumped in and out. So that'll work, but I'll send you all away for about 5 minutes.
Sure. Hi, y'all. Thanks for coming back. Just got to hang on for like just a couple more minutes for all the fun stuff. So before I pass this over and formally close it, I just want to see if there are any questions or ahas just about the tool itself, or any sort of things that you heard today around the assessment HLPs. And hopefully as you watch, you're like, gosh, I do that, because I guarantee you all are doing this. And it's just more of being able to describe and say, this is why I'm doing this, and this is how it leads to this level of performance. Yeah, Miranda, I think that's it. And that was the whole thing about educator prep when they came up with it, is that they've got to define the practices so that they can reflect on the practice and improve the practice, right? If we can't define it or pull it out, then we don't know what we need to change. So yeah, so, oh, good, a comprehensive review. Yeah, and creating that hypothesis, right? We can create a formal hypothesis, but sometimes we can have a more informal, like in our day-to-day, like, why is this kid not attending? Why is this kid, not getting this particular academic skill, right? We can think in those ways to help us think about, is it design or delivery? Good. Well, I want to thank you all. We have our next session, and I'm going to pass it over to Dina, to close this out. And have you got resources for creating graphs of data easily? Tom, I don't know if you want to put the link to the Wyoming Instructional Network free graph. The tool, it actually is on the National Center on Intensive Intervention. We can share that. I will also share that paper pencil graphs, while they may not be fancy, actually have a pretty good effect size, because for one, it engages students. It's very visible, it's active, we can talk about it. And so think about it, like, especially with secondary folks. So yeah, Miranda. And so I'll actually put in the link to the free graphing tool if you want to create a fancy one. So, and Dina, it's all you.
Well, Dr. Bailey, once again, this has been amazing. And I thank you for your time and your expertise. Every time I listen to you, I come away with even a little more than I knew before. So I thank you for that.